Hello and welcome to the Student Counsel podcast, an educational advice show made for students and by students where everyone is qualified to talk about their own experiences. My name is Carter Dvorak, and today I am so excited to be joined by my history professor from the University of Michigan, who taught me the history of superheroes and American pop cultures, Professor Anthony Mora. Thank you for coming on the show today. I cannot wait to chat with you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, before we start into anything, I just want to hear, what have been your favorite 5 minutes of the past week?
So my favorite 5 minutes of the past week probably was doing some research that I've been working on in terms of the character of Zorro and looking into a person, an actual historical person named Joaquin Marietta, who's often claimed to be the real life Zorro from the 19th century. So that was a lot of fun.
That sounds really cool. I'm really excited to get into all of the Zorro research because it just sounds really fascinating and really exciting. But I didn't know that there was like a real life, Zorro out there, but that seems really cool.
Well, people claim that.
Right.
I have my doubts because I'm not sure the creator of Zorro really was that invested in real history, but this actual person named Marietta has been linked to Zorro for a long time now. And he was Marietta was a very interesting character himself. So he was sort of a vigilante who was operating during the time of the gold rush in California in late 1840s, early 1850s.
Okay, interesting. Was he all purple or no?
No, he did wear a cloak from time to time, but no Z's carved or M's carved into anything as far as I'm aware. So,
alas. Okay, before I dive more into Zorro talk, because I could easily just deviate right into that, I want to back up a little bit. I'm just really curious to hear about. I love talking to everybody's college experiences. And so you first graduated with a bachelor's in art history. Before anything, I just want to hear, how did that passion for history develop?
So I think that, the story I often tell, and I've told it so many times, it's probably almost true, is that I always had a pretty clear interest in history. Even as a kid, my parents were really interested in history. And growing up in New Mexico, there's a lot of it around you in terms of native cultures, the sort of long-standing colonization from Spain and Mexico, then the United States. But when I was somewhere around fifth or sixth grade, I read a book on the Titanic, and this was like way before the sort of big blockbuster movie on the Titanic, and even before they had found the wreckage. And after I read that, I, would sort of relate to people what I had learned from that. And people were actually really interested to find out about things that I knew. And I realized, actually, there's something really exciting about being able to tell people things about the past. That was probably my first entry into history. And then I was fortunate to have some pretty good history teachers in high school, sort of continue to stoke my interests. And then when I went to the University of New Mexico, I had imagined that I would be a high school history teacher, but while I was at the university, a couple of things happened. One, I learned about being able to do your own original research, going into archives, looking at documents, and that was even better into my mind, than reading history. And then the other thing was that, the histories that are often told about the United States lack, especially then, which was in the 1990s, lacked so many different groups. And for me, especially Mexican Americans, just weren't present. And so I had a lot of questions about where they were during particular moments, especially in the 19th century. And so that encouraged me or prompted me to want to find out and to do that type of research.
Okay, that's really interesting. I feel like I even see the track of not only going into history to learn, but the history to tell and to share those stories, which is really, really cool. And I think you were a really good, I would almost say storyteller in the way you did your lectures in the course that I got to have with you, or you did a really great job explaining everything in this kind of narrative fashion, which is really awesome. And so overall, do you kind of look back with fondness of your time at University of New Mexico? I remember reading somewhere that you graduated summa cum laude, and I'm curious of kind of how'd you maintain that? I assume that didn't come like easily to you, but was that something you went in wanting, or did it kind of just, were you so engaged that it happened?
I would say it happened. Part of it was because I did major in history and I was really interested in those classes. So when you're interested in something, you tend to do better in them than if you're not. I do look back fondly at the University of New Mexico. it is a really unique college experience. It's a big state university, of course, that serves a state that a lot of people don't know a lot about. So it's New Mexico is a non-white majority state, so it's incredibly diverse. The student body then, and I think it's still true, was non-traditional students. So the average age of undergraduates when I was there was 28.
Oh,
So
wow.
it wasn't a very typical sort of age cohort to be part of. I was, what would be typically the age cohort, but a lot of my peers in class weren't. And so that made for a really different set of discussions in class, a really different set of dynamics of people bringing a lot of life experiences into the classroom. So, I have a lot of positive, and I had really great professors at New Mexico as well, especially in the history department. So I thought it was fantastic. The other thing was that I had to work when I was an undergraduate. So I was working part-time, sometimes full-time, often full-time actually. So that was pretty exhausting. So that also made the experience probably not very typical for most college students. But
Yeah. Did you find work like with the university, or was it more off university, just kind of working in other spaces?
no, I worked in other spaces. So I worked mostly in clerical jobs. So I worked for a while at a psychiatric hospital. It was in Albuquerque. And then my senior year, I worked at a real estate company that managed one of those sort of tall buildings in downtown Albuquerque.
Okay, interesting. Now, after University of New Mexico, you went to Notre Dame for a PhD, which I was kind of surprised because my like Michigan rivalry senses were tingling. But I'm curious, how did that college experience differ, both like going to a different school and also getting a PhD versus a Bachelor of Arts?
Well, Notre Dame was, I mean, so incredibly different than New Mexico. So going from a big state university to a small private liberal arts college was incredibly different. As I said, a very non-traditional student body at New Mexico and a very traditional student body at Notre Dame. But as a graduate student, you're also a little bit removed from the sort of same type of experiences that undergraduates are having. I would say also that, I was really committed. I was really wanting to do a PhD in history, but I was also probably very naive and a bit unprepared for what a PhD program actually entailed. It's a super intense amount of work that I didn't necessarily maybe fully understand. And maybe that's probably good because maybe it would have deterred me from doing it. Probably pursuing a PhD in history is not a rational choice in any circumstance, but it really worked out. And again, I had a really great advisor whose name was Gail Biederman, who works on race and gender and very much influenced the type of thinking and the type of classes I teach today. So things seem to have worked out.
That's really good that they seem to have worked out. I'm curious, what then, even going from Notre Dame to Michigan, do you feel any rivalry? But beyond that, like what kind of led you then to going to University of Michigan, and kind of how did that differ from when you first went to Texas A&M?
So yeah, thanks. My first job was at Texas A&M University, which was again back to another big, large state university. It's a flagship university for Texas. I had really good colleagues there, good experiences there. But when the job at Michigan came up, I applied for it because, of course, Michigan is such an amazing place, and the history department in particular is one of the highest ranked in the nation. So I enjoyed my time at A&M,
Yeah.
but I definitely hoped to come and was very happy to come to Michigan. In terms of rivalry, well, I mean, Michigan does pay my salary, so I think my loyalty will always go there over, my alma mater. No offense, Notre Dame, but there is a financial stake I have in Michigan now, so that's probably where I'm at with that.
That is very, very fair for sure. Now, I'm curious, it was cool to see that you've written a book, Border Dilemmas, which details the racial and national uncertainties in New Mexico from 1848 to 1912. And I'm really curious because I haven't really gotten to talk to many professors who have written like books before. What was that process in writing that? When did you know, like, yes, this is what I want to make a first book about? And like, how do you think that even differed from like teaching about history to writing about it in a book sense? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, well, I mean, so it goes back to what I said earlier about being at the University of New Mexico and feeling like the classes I was taking, even at a place like New Mexico, which again has a Latino majority population, they just weren't there. and especially in the 19th century. So, even in, very thoughtful classes about U.S. history, like the U.S. Survey, it would come time to talk about the U.S.-Mexican War, which was from 1846 to 1848, which is when the United States basically takes what is today Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And the way that was often presented was, oh, the Mexican people who were living there were fine with it and just, were happy to be part of the US. And that just really didn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, just logically that a
Yeah.
war had happened. Suddenly they're, sucked into a different nation. But, there just at that time had not been a lot of historians who had really looked seriously at what Mexican people in that time period were thinking. And so I just had questions. What did they think about that? How did they feel about becoming part of the US? And as you might imagine, they had divided feelings. Some people were willing to take their chance with the US, and some people were very unhappy about being pulled into the US. And that created tensions within the Mexican community about, perceived loyalties, national loyalties, which then also intersected with, really strong racism that had developed in the US as part of the war, but maybe even before the war, that continues to haunt the US today. So those were, some of the questions that I had for that book, which started as my dissertation. And it is a different sort of enterprise than teaching a class. So when you teach a class, you're really trying to introduce, a wide range of different ideas and different perspectives to students, a sampling of things that happened, things that can be very representative. Whereas with a book, you can really focus on something specific and make your own very clear argument about something about the past, at least for historians.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I'd love to. Does that topic come up in some of the classes you still teach at U of M? Like, do you kind of ever, have you ever taught that book as a class, essentially? Like, where you've had that book as, the center point of it? Or do you kind of try to weave that into other courses?
Well, I probably don't have the ego to sign my own book to a class, although some people do, but
Some people do.
I'm probably a little bit too shy about that. But definitely, I teach classes on the history of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the US. And, we do spend a considerable amount of time in the earlier period. Whereas I think older versions of a class like that would have really focused a lot in the 1960s and 1970s, right? Which tend to be kind of the decades that for some reason people, well, not for some reason, there are good reasons why people gravitate towards those decades. But
Yeah.
I think to a disservice to those earlier generations who were really trying to set up things and figure things out, and kind of often forgotten about. So that's probably how it influences the way in which I teach.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've kind of delved into a bunch of the different history topics that you've taught of, again, Mexican American history, sexuality and history and superheroes and pop culture. I guess I'm curious, as you continue to teach these courses and, interface with these different and new groups of students all these times, has your interactions with each of these subjects kind of changed as you've been in more classes, engaged in discussions and taught them over time?
So yes, I mean, I think that I learn a lot from students when I teach. And I think that every class usually has its own personality because it's a combination of all the different students who are in it, what interests they're bringing to the class. Teaching a history of Mexicans in the US attracts a very different set of students than perhaps the history of superheroes class, which attracts a very different set of students than my sexuality class that attracts. So those dynamics are really interesting to think about. But it's also, what students want to know about the past has changed itself over time from when I first started teaching, 20 years ago. It's inevitably the things that are going on around us today prompt different sorts of, inquiries about what people were up to in the past or what was relevant about the past for how we understand ourselves today. So, teaching is often a sort of ongoing process of revision and changing and rethinking things, but it's also a lot of fun, I think. So
yeah, it seems like it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun on the student's end, and yeah, I'm always curious because I get 4 years worth of being on the receiving end of being in courses, but I'm always fascinated by how these students have kind of changed, the student perspectives have changed changed over time as you've gotten to see so many classes come through. And now I really want to dive into the superheroes course and
Right?
history 328, particularly history of superheroes and heroes in American pop culture. And I'm just curious, like, how did this start? How did your idea like get to that point? And like, was this a tough sell to get this as a class?
So it started because as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, I'm working on a project on the character of Zorro, who was one of the very early sort of superhero-esque type characters that came out of Pulp Fiction in 1919. And so because I was thinking about that character, I also was thinking about the sort of larger genre of superheroes and heroes in popular culture, but I was doing it from a historian's perspective. So I'm not trained as a literary person. I'm actually, not really trained as a media scholar. I'm trained as a historian. So that shapes the way in which I think about these characters. And I felt like there was, there's something really important and interesting about how these characters have been so central to US entertainment since the early 20th century, or if not even earlier. In our class, we went back even to the 19th century.
Yeah.
And I felt like there was a way in which we could use the heroes to think through some of the sort of fundamental moments of change, particularly around questions of gender, masculinity, femininity, how those play out in the superheroes. I think that, again, I was lucky. The history department at Michigan embraces experimentation. I think they were curious about what would happen in that type of class, or, it was certainly an uncertain idea about what would go on in a class that focused on superheroes, but they were willing, fortunately, for me to try it out, and I think it's been pretty good. At least I've had really great students. Yeah.
And you've taught the subject matter very, very well as well. But it was an absolute blast to be in that course, and I think definitely reframed the way that I thought of superheroes and heroes in fiction and such. Like, did you find that I guess you'd already been doing it with Zorro, but kind of diving into the other superheroes and like Marvel and DC, did that also affect your relationship with those characters and like kind of teaching and prepping for the course?
It did change my relationship to them. I think there is something different when you approach something as entertainment, that you're intentionally often shutting off parts of your brain to just sort of have an experience that's fun and a little bit frivolous. But if you reactivate parts of your brain that are, more analytical, you start to see things in a different way and ask different questions about what the heroes are. Why did they emerge in the particular time periods they emerged? What made these particular superheroes have longevity, whereas there's, dozens, if not hundreds of other superheroes that have been invented that have long since been forgotten and never picked up. I mean, so there's all sorts of really interesting things to ask about this phenomenon. And it's also, for today, it's one of the few touchstones we have in US popular culture that almost everybody can access. Almost everybody knows who Superman is. Almost everybody knows what the Marvel universe is. Even if they aren't ardent fans of it, they probably have seen enough that they can talk about it or have some sense of what it's about. So
yeah, absolutely. And I remember talking to you at the start of the semester. You had taught that same course like a couple of years prior for the first time. Now that you've gone through 2 full teaching semesters of teaching the course, did you notice any big shifts from the first time you taught it to now, or was it overall still pretty similar?
So it did change from the first. I mean, any class that you teach, you learn a lot, especially the first time you're teaching it, and especially what works and what doesn't work as well. And I think when I taught it the first time, one of the things that I learned was that I had assumed a lot of people would be comic book readers, which is not the case anymore. Most people's access point is actually the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which makes total sense, right, in retrospect.
Yeah.
But for some reason, I had sort of assumed that the majority of students would arrive having read a bunch of comic books growing up, which is just not the case. So, even just knowing that helped me figure out how to orient the class in a way that, would start on a more common ground of what people actually know. And I think reading the comic books, hopefully was surprising and interesting in a different
Yeah.
way if your sort of first frame of reference is the cinematic universe. So, but yeah, this last time with you and everybody who was in that class, it was a blast for me.
Oh yeah.
Everybody was so engaged with it. It was a lot of fun.
It really was a blast, and I definitely fell into that camp of being much more engaged in the cinematic universes than the like comic book world. So that was really a lot of my first exposures to like superhero comics, and it was fascinating to like take them on from that academic perspective and that historical lens. Had you been a comic book reader growing up, or did you kind of have to get immersed into that too when you started working on the class?
So when I was growing up, I was, kind of a lazy comic book reader. So I did read comics, but I wasn't very rigorous about, collecting them. And, they're serialized. So you read like each issue as it comes out. And I was kind of lazy about doing that. So I would miss whole, issues and then not have any idea what was going on. But I did definitely read them when I was younger. I was always a little bit more into the DC heroes, than the Marvel ones, but I certainly like them all. But
Yeah, that's very fair. Now, I want to loop back around to Zorro again.
Okay.
And I guess I'm curious, how did Zorro stick out to you as like really wanting to lock in on this character in particular? And what was your introduction to Zorro? Did it come like almost academically first? Or you growing up with those books as a kid? Or how did that start?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I did grow up with Zorro. Zorro for my father was a really important character. So my father was Mexican American, my mother was Irish American. And so for my father, who grew up in New Mexico in the 1950s, Zorro for him was like the only time he saw a Latino person who wasn't playing, an idiot or a clown or, a cold-blooded killer. Like Zorro actually got to be the hero and got to, stand out. There are complexities to Zorro, certainly, but,
Yeah.
And so because of that, he passed that interest and love onto his kids that, so Zorro was always kind of around when I was growing up. And then in the early 1980s, there was a spoof of Zorro that came out that was a film called Zorro the Gay Blade, which was a comedy film that had a gay Zorro character. And even though, I was a very young kid and I obviously was nowhere near coming out at that point, but that definitely appealed to me on some sort of subconscious level. That was sort of campy and fun and a really different take on the character. It's not a great film in retrospect, but certainly I loved it when I was a young kid. So it was, so all that's to say that Zorro was sort of always around when I was young. And then there was a Zorro cartoon also when I was young that was short-lived. It had Zorro action figure. But then later on, since as a historian, I focused on the experiences of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the US, it interested me that Zorro had been this character that with such a long life, 100 years of Zorro in U.S. popular culture, and that's interesting to think about. Again, given that often, especially in the early 20th century and more recently, there is such a strong anti-Mexican sentiment in the U.S. So how is it possible to reconcile this character who's often beloved with also, a culture that is very hostile to anything Mexican. So that was sort of my starting question for that project, which I'm still working to figure out.
Yeah. I was gonna ask, and like, is there, and do you have you thought of an end goal in mind? Of is this another book? Is this like, have you thought of like when you have this history, what you've thought of doing with it?
Well, I hope to have a book. That is the goal. It is, I'm moving a bit slowly with it, but I do hope ultimately to have a book. And in some ways, the book will be like the superheroes class, except it'll just focus on the one hero. But it'll, I hope, carry over time and think about, the different versions of Zorro that have come out and how those have tied back to the sort of larger social, cultural, political landscape of the US, and why that particular version of Zorro seemed to resonate at specific moments in time.
Yeah, that sounds like a fascinating read. We got a couple of those, like kind of the week of Zorro, which was really fascinating. So that was my introduction to the character, and he really stuck out to me. I really enjoyed that book that we read of his, and I'd be curious, have you thought of too, like, what you would want to see from the future of Zorro? Like, have you thought of, if they did another film, like, how would you want them to do it, or anything in that sense?
So, there are a couple Zorro projects that are in development. So Disney Plus has a project that they hope to launch that's, I think, a reboot of their 1950s television show, the Zorro
Oh,
show. And then I think Amazon Prime also has a Zorro project in the works. I think that for me, I think that it would be always best if people read history if they're going to do historical fiction. So, as we talked about when we talked about Zorro, like, the creator of Zorro really had no idea what was going on in terms of history. So it's even unclear
yeah.
when in the past this is supposed to be taking place. Is it supposed to be, in the Spanish colonial period? Is it supposed to be in the Mexican period? I mean, it's just like the markers of when this is supposed to be are actually completely contradictory. So, it would, as a historian, it would be nice if the new projects on Zorro did their due diligence and tried to figure out at least something about the past. And I would also say to be good caretakers of a character that is one of the very few Latino superhero characters around. So I hope they're also mindful of that.
Yeah, I hope the same. I'll be really curious. I didn't know about those. I remember Googling, but I hadn't seen much. But that's kind of exciting if they do. I feel like a Disney Plus and Amazon Prime show are going to be two very different takes on the character. But I'll be curious. Yeah, that seems really interesting, though. I'll have to follow those more. Final kind of question about Zorro. Has there been like a truly shocking, or like, can you think back to like the most interesting discovery that you'd found once you started digging into this research?
Well, there've been so many things. I mean, I think what has interested me is how many different iterations of Zorro there are. I mean, so, the main Zorro, the sort of central Zorro, is this wealthy guy, Diego de la Vega, who, is in colonial Los Angeles, or maybe Mexican Los Angeles. Again, the time period's often unclear. But there's been women Zorros. There's been cartoons where Zorro's in the future. There's been Zorro meets Django from Django Unchained. Zorro meets Dracula. Zorro. I mean, like the characters had this very interesting sort of set of possibilities that I probably didn't. I mean, I just sort of assumed that Zorro was always, set in a particular place with a certain, supporting cast of characters, and that was kind of it. So, yeah, that's been interesting to me. The different versions of Zorro that have come out.
Yeah, that is really cool. It was funny. It's very mild spoilers for Ted Lasso, but in the finale, they had a Zorro reference, and it was very satisfying to watch that, especially after the class. And I texted Natasha immediately, and it was like, did you see that? And it was a fun moment to like understand that little note, because it's like, it's one of those things, like, once you learn, I think, like, once I knew about Zorro, I kind of see him peeking up in little bits of pop culture more and more. So it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, he's also interesting because he's not consistently popular, right? Like he
Yeah.
sort of has these moments where he's, hugely popular and then he kind of falls away. I mean, he never completely disappears, but he, sort of recedes and then he becomes back, which is different than, say, like Superman or Batman. Although Batman has his own cycles of change, but
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, so maybe we're on the moment of another Zorro resurgence.
Maybe. I would be excited to see it. I think it'd be cool to see him be a player in pop culture, like really on the forefront again. So, yeah, and I'm excited to see how that research continues to go. It just seems fascinating to get to catalog a character like that.
I mean, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
So
yeah, right.
I'm amazed I'm paid for the job that I am paid for. So,
That's incredible. All right, I want to jump into a couple of fun rapid fire questions. There's a couple superhero ones in there too, but I wanted to ask them the ones I love asking everybody. First one is, what is the most impactful piece of advice that somebody has ever given to you?
I mean, I've gotten lots of great advice, but something that stands out to me that I often think about, at least in terms of my work life, is to be the colleague you want, not necessarily the colleagues you have. So, to always be generous, to, always do the best you can, even if sometimes the people around you are a little bit frustrating. So
I really like that. I think that applies to a lot of situations, but I really like it in that context. That's a great piece of advice. And then the other one I love asking is, do you have like an ultimate tip for somebody going into college?
So, I mean, I'm not sure I have special insight, but I would say, most university life is about just simply showing up. Like, that gets you really far. So, attending class, going to lectures, just being present is really the thing that will help the most. And university, whether at the undergraduate level or the graduate level, is just about actually sticking through it and getting finished. So, yeah, show up.
That's a good one. That's a really important foundational piece of advice. I love that. Switching gears entirely, I do have a favorite superhero and also like a favorite superhero movie or something, because I feel like those have been so big.
So, well, I'm off. I'm
Yeah,
awfully partial to Zorro.
was gonna say.
But we'll set him aside because that might be a little obvious. So when I was young, the two heroes that I liked most were Spider-Man and Wonder Woman. So, and I've always had a soft spot for both of those characters. I think that each of them, when they were created, pushed the boundaries for their time period of what the superhero genre was doing, which, obviously I didn't understand as a kid. But now in retrospect, I understand why they gained popularity, although as we talked about, they also have complicated histories and backstories, especially
Yeah.
if they're creators.
Yep.
Yeah, I really like those two characters. In terms of a favorite superhero movie, yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, I'm so partial to it's not a movie, but I'm really partial to the Linda Carter 1970s Wonder Woman television series, which is super campy and very 70s, but, it's also nostalgic for me. So,
Yeah, that's really nice. Because you brought up Spider-Man, I'm always curious. Do you have a preference between Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland, or even Miles Morales?
I mean, I love them all, actually. I
Yeah,
mean, I really like Miles Morales. I really, really liked Into the Spider-Verse. I'm excited to see the new one, which is
me
just
too.
about to come out as of this recording. So, yeah, I definitely like that character. In terms of the live action, I never thought they could replace Tobey Maguire, but then I think Tom Holland has been amazing. So, poor Andrew Garfield always gets forgotten.
He
But
does. But
but
yeah,
I think they all have been great. Actually, it's interesting that that character is also a very flexible character who can adapt to different, different character personality traits, different personas. So,
yeah, I
do you have
completely
a favorite?
agree. I think I'm also partial to Tom Holland. I think it's the one that also I was at the like kind of the youngest age when his came into debut, where I was in like the peak of middle school, and like I think I just really clung to him because there was like I think the lowest age gap even in part, where like I feel like I related to him more than I could like look and relate to like Tobey Maguire, just because there was such a gap. But yeah, I love all three of them, and I'm glad Andrew's finally getting his. I feel like after the latest Tom Holland film, Andrew Garfield kind of came back into the spotlight a little bit. But again, they're all great iterations of the character.
Yeah, and I mean, very talented actors, I think,
Mm-hmm.
who have been cast into those roles and each bringing their own sort of interpretation to it. So,
Yeah, it's fascinating that the majority of them are British. I think that's just an
right.
interesting element, like playing this New York kid. Now, I want to ask about for the final project for our history class was either you could kind of like what you're doing with Zorro on a much smaller scale, kind of go back and catalog a history of a superhero and look into those themes of the character, or you could create your own. And I had a really great time creating our own, and I'm curious, have you given any thought to like what hero you would create and maybe some of the dynamics that you would include in that character?
So, well, of course, I mean, when you work with this genre, you think like, well, can I come up with a character? I mean, I think one of the reasons I became a historian is I'm not that creative. So, it's easier to tell stories about something that happened than to invent new stories for me. But I would love a character again who is a Mexican American character who has a lot of popularity. I mean, as much as I love Zorro, he is a complicated figure
Yeah.
that has baggage that is, maybe a different type of character could not have as much of. Somebody who had the ability to make politicians be truthful would be nice.
That would be cool. Yeah. Have you like explored much of like Blue Beetle? I feel like he's one of the other more prevalent like Mexican American characters that I've seen.
Yeah, only very minorly. So it is a character I should probably know more about, but I don't know a lot about Blue Beetle actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, explore more.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't either. I know he has a film coming up pretty soon, which I'm excited to see because I think that'll be cool to see him on the big screen. But yeah, I don't know much from. He was in one of the Batman cartoons I grew up with, but that was about it. But yeah, I think those are all great dynamics to a superhero character as well. I completely agree, and I think it's been really cool to see in the kind of recent Marvel universe. There's been, I feel like, a lot stronger push for representation on screen and broadening the backgrounds of the heroes in their lineup, which I think is a good push for the superhero medium.
Well, I do too. I mean, again, if the heroes and superheroes are supposed to be idealizations of what we as a society are supposed to value, then I think those heroes and superheroes should also then reflect the diversity that's within that society. Valorize the elements of the society that are already exceptional. So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Absolutely. The final question is, what song would you add to a school survival playlist?
Yeah, that's a hard one because again, I'm fairly far removed now from the age in which I would be a student. But I would say "Take Your Mama Out" by the Scissor Sisters would be a fun song.
Okay.
I think that could live through. It's actually probably almost 20 years old now, but still, that would be what I'd recommend.
Awesome. I can't say that I have listened to that song, so I'll be excited to listen to it, and I'll throw it on the playlist for sure. Now, thank you so much for coming on to the show. We've kind of reached the end of this little interview, but I'm curious, any other final question is, do you have anything else you want to share or plug or promote?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, in general, take more history classes. So most universities offer history of pretty much anything that you might be interested in. So whoever's listening, you were well served and to have a history class. So
yeah, I'll throw that in the link in the description, the like LSA course guide, and I'll just preset it so it's all history, so you can go through. Yeah, maybe I can plug your upcoming classes next semester if they're not already filled up. But awesome. Well, thank you again. It's been a joy to catch up, and it was such a fun and amazing class to take with you. So I'm really grateful for that. And you'll be offering it again in the coming winter semester. So if you're listening, I wholeheartedly recommend if you're at UMich to take this course. So
well, thanks so much for hosting me. This has been great.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, listener, for listening to another episode of the Student Counsel. My name is Carter Dvorak. That is Professor Anthony Mora. I am so grateful for you to listen. If you want to find us, our Instagram is @StucoPod and our email is stucopod@gmail.com. Wishing you the best of luck and the best of times in all of your educational endeavors. The Student Counsel is adjourned.